I want to talk a little bit about the scandal pertaining to the Hugo Awards in Chengdu, China. And I've decided to do this as a lead-off YouTube video because I'm speaking from the heart and I want you to see me. And if you get a chance, head over to Hildy's MKE videos on YouTube and you can see how I look in person when I'm in front of the microphone. On the other hand, if you're already there, thank you. For the sake of those who don't know, here's a quick recap. The Hugo Awards are science fiction's oldest and most prestigious award. It's done for fans, by fans, making it something like the People's Choice Awards, but with way more clout in the SFF community. The Nebula Awards are also out there, but this is more of a juried award, akin to the Oscars, but has less clout among fans. There are others, like the Saturn Awards or the Dragon Awards, but none of those has the age or prestige of a Hugo. In 2021, China won the right to host Worldcon, Chengdu, China. The granddaddy of all the fan conventions is Worldcon, and the place where Hugo Awards are held. There was some trepidation regarding having a Worldcon there, as various censorship laws in that country might disrupt things. There were also concerns regarding human rights violations over there. But China has a huge number of science fiction and fantasy fans. China is absolutely wild about sci-fi, and that love is infectious. So while some writers decided to boycott on the grounds of the plight of the Uyghurs or the protesters in Hong Kong, others like me decided China deserved a chance to prove itself. The Worldcon was held last October, and it was spectacular. If you were there in person, that is. The online experience was notably absent. But months later, when all the festivities were over, and the Hugo voting statistics were finally released, the horrible truth became known. Certain nominees, such as Neil Gaiman, R.F. Kuang, Paul Weimer, and Jianzhe Zhao, were deemed ineligible for no immediately apparent reason. All fans really got was a cryptic statement from the Hugo administration co-chair, quote, "After reviewing the Constitution and the rules we must follow, the administration team determined those works/persons were not eligible," close quote. Fans were outraged, but left without answers, and slowly, it became obvious that Chinese censorship laws did, in fact, interfere with the Hugo Award nominating process. Then the other shoe fell. Emails were leaked which definitively proved that certain works were deemed ineligible for a Hugo Award not because of WSFS rules, but because of concerns over Chinese law. Those emails were handed over to Chris Barkley at Capricorn in Chicago. He teamed up with Jason Sanford to write up a report on it, and that report landed like an absolute bombshell on the SFF community. And the proof of Chinese law censorship interference, and more importantly, the Western contingent of the Hugo Award Committee's complicity in it, has left fans absolutely white hot with rage. I think Jason Sanford himself, who was the subject of some of this censorship, summarized it best. He said, quote, "This really just cut to the core of the awards. For a genre that believes so deeply in free speech to willingly take part in doing research on political issues of awards finalists, knowing that it's going to be used to eliminate some of those finalists, it's outrageous," close quote. And it is outrageous. SFF fans have every right to be pissed off. But I'm going to give you my working hypothesis as to what happened, for those who haven't heard it yet, and then give you a different perspective. It's quite obvious to point out that Hugo nominees were vetted in such a way as to look for any potential issues where those nominees ran afoul of Chinese censorship law. And that's horrifying, to say the least. But WSFS rules only apply to Worldcon. They will always, as a matter of course, be subject to the laws of whatever country happens to be hosting the Worldcon at the time. And China was the first instance where such a nation has laws which oppress freedom of speech. The Hugos had no built-in defenses against something like this. As soon as Chengdu, China won the bid, it became inevitable that Chinese law would override WSFS rules in some way. The legal realities were set in stone. The Hugo Awards administration had to deal, therefore, with an incredibly thorny problem. If they included all the nominees, regardless of political opinion, they ran the real risk of offending the Chinese government and seeing their fellow fans in China, who are, let's remember, our potential and likely actual pro-democracy allies, thrown in jail. There may even have been an outside chance that many of the guests they brought in from the US and Canada, meaning they themselves, would also have been jailed. Did they know this with absolute certainty? Probably not. But they knew the threat was absolutely real. No matter what, someone was going to be offended. So their choice was, do they offend the Chinese government, which has teeth, or do they offend fandom, which, let's be honest, has no teeth at all? At some point, those insiders must have sat down in a private room and just hashed it out, saying something like, my God, this is threatening to undo everything. This is threatening to ruin it. What are we going to do about these Chinese censorship laws? And this conversation in this darkened room probably happened long before the time period in which the leaked emails cover. In the end, they made the only choice they could. But they needed a legal loophole. And here's my working hypothesis. Maybe I'm wrong, but this holds water. The Chengdu Worldcon's Code of Conduct clearly stipulates that all participants in the Worldcon must obey local laws. A similar statement was made in one of the progress reports the Chengdu Committee published. I think it was number 2. So since the Code of Conduct clearly states that one cannot participate in Worldcon if they're in violation, then those nominees who are deemed to be offensive to Chinese censorship laws would be ruled ineligible on the grounds of violations pertaining to the Code of Conduct. The reason they couldn't outright say this was obvious. Nobody wants to be declared in violation of the Worldcon's Code of Conduct through no fault of their own. And fans don't want to see nominees excluded because of Chinese law. That's not fucking fair. And they're right. It's not fair. But that's what the laws dictated. So the tactic chosen afterwards was to delay releasing the Hugo voting statistics until the last possible minute, and then issue a deliberately coded statement saying that nominees were eliminated based on the WISP's constitution and the rules we must follow. Wait for the hammer to fall and hope it all blows over. Well, as we all know by now, it hasn't blown over and likely never will. When I gave my initial outline regarding my working hypothesis, I said that if it were admitted that Chinese laws interfered with the Hugos, the debate would immediately shift over to which Chinese laws were violated, and whether deeming those works ineligible was even fair. I predicted that it would result in a huge kerfuffle. Well, that's exactly what happened. The leaked emails reveal that candidates had to be ruled out if they could be seen as defamatory towards China or sympathizing towards Taiwan or Hong Kong or Tibet. And sure enough, the debate is now over whether the candidates were truly in violation of Chinese law. Paul Weimer, for example, was flagged for possibly having visited Tibet. And there's a big difference between visiting Tibet and sympathizing with the Dalai Lama. But as it turns out, Paul didn't even visit Tibet. He visited Nepal. People are debating about R.F. Kuang's book, Babel. It was excluded for having things which might be defamatory towards China. I've read this book now. It doesn't really have things in it which are defamatory towards China. It does have a lot of Occidental ethnocentrism. The book depicts very bluntly the attitude of superiority of Great Britain over China, without endorsing that attitude, mind you, quite the opposite. But certain anti-Chinese ethnic slurs were to be found in that book, uttered by British characters. I think it was probably likely that overall tone which disqualified it. And now most fans are arguing that this judgment was wrong, especially since the book was published in China without incident. I predict that these leaked emails will not be the only last big revelation about this event. Chris Barkley and Jason Sanford may yet have another bombshell to drop on all of us. I think now that these emails are out there, that someone else a little bit closer to the incident might have a crisis of conscience and come forward. But for the most part, people are coming to the conclusion that there was no justification for this. Just some of what I've been hearing includes this statement, and I'll do this person a favor by not naming him. Quote, I condemn all involved in this. They chose this willingly when they had the ability and option to walk away. Instead, they destroyed the Hugo and did potentially irreparable damage to Chinese fandom. They deserve no quarter. Close quote. Someone else told me on Facebook, quote, even if we accept the premise that there was no way to do the awards in a fair manner, and I'm not conceding that, none of the Americans, Canadians, or Europeans involved were forced to comply by force. They did so of their own volition, close quote. Did they, though? You see, these were not just any fans. These were not just any Hugo administrators. These were the best and brightest among fandom in the Western Hemisphere. The Chengdu Committee brought them over at no small expense to themselves because they were the best. They were the ones with the most experience on how to run a Worldcon, the ones with the highest levels of integrity, the highest depths of knowledge. They wouldn't suddenly all have broken bad en masse this way, and it's absurd of people to think so. People right now are hell-bent on assuming the worst, but when giving the benefit of the doubt makes so much logical sense, it's hard to justify bringing out the pitchforks and torches this soon. We weren't there. We didn't set foot in China, most of us. We didn't have to look one of our new friends, one of our Chinese hosts, one of those who paid our way, one of those likely pro-democracy allies who covered our room and board straight in the eye to explain to that person face to face why they should have to risk prison to ensure the integrity of a trophy, and that for only 1 year. It's so easy to blame the Hugo administrators from the safety of our own First Amendment privilege and insist that a plastic rocket is worth more than someone's freedom. The hatred and the vitriol that people are spitting around at each other right now is getting way out of hand. I'm seeing people's lives ruined, and that must stop. We're blaming the wrong people. In our rush to find people to blame, we blame the Westerners who we feel should have known better. Except, of course, they did know better. We already know who the people who didn't know better are, and they are the oppressors, the Chinese government. They and their stupid, vague, ambiguous, and oppressive laws are what ruined the Hugo Awards in 2023. Deep down, we already knew this. They are to blame. The Hugo administrators were bound by the code of conduct to obey local laws. Their hands were tied. I can't prove it definitively because nobody's talking, but it's right there in black and white in the rules. Do the math. I think the evidence is pretty clear that the Hugo committee simply had no other choice but to do what it did. Yet over and over, I'm hearing people saying things like, well, then why didn't they simply resign? It's not that simple. Even if everyone from the US, Canada, and Europe just suddenly resigned in protest, Chengdu still won the right to host the Worldcon, and it would have gone on without them. Either that or they would have brought in a whole new slate of Westerners who would be brought in to provide the appearance of cohesion among global fandom. And again, exactly the same outcome would have taken place. Besides, the Hugo administrators couldn't resign in protest. Why? Because that would have grabbed the attention of the Chinese government more loudly than anything. Some of the sponsors might even have decided to complain to the government directly, and don't think they wouldn't. In fact, if another Worldcon were ever held in China, and I think that's highly unlikely at this point, exactly the same sort of thing would happen all over again. Even if you had an entirely new Hugo administrative team comprised of nothing but Dave McCarty's most ardent and harshest critics, the outcome would be the same. Why? Because Chinese laws make it inevitable. If a Worldcon is held in China, the law of China will always override WSFIS rules. So let's blame China's government already. Does the Western contingent of the Hugo administration have some blame here? Absolutely. They mishandled it. There was clearly some bungling on the vote counting process too, especially something which they mistook for a slate of nominees. And there may have been some things literally lost in translation, which led to that being ruled out. And I think it's fair to say at this point that putting out a single coded statement and clamming up about it has not been an effective tactic. But right now, fans are assuming that anyone involved with Chengdu in any way is somehow automatically dirty. That's bullshit. How dare we assume the worst about our own when all along we knew the correct answer? We knew that China's laws were to blame. We knew that the vast majority of the blame needs to be dumped at the feet of the Chinese government and the fuckery their laws cause everyone over there. The blame falls primarily on Chairman Xi. I've had a chance to volunteer with those involved in this at other conventions. During that time, nobody shared any secrets with me, but one thing was overtly obvious, and that was the love the Hugo Committee has towards Chinese fandom. They were motivated by a position of love. They chose to participate in running Worldcon over there because they opposed bigotry. They chose inclusiveness. They stood for Worldcon being a global community. And it is stupidly wrong-headed to automatically assume the worst about such people. It makes no logical sense. Yes, they were treated like rock stars. Yes, their airfare and hotel was covered. And yes, that might go to somebody's head. But those fans in China love science fiction and fantasy with a passion so infectious that you can't help but fall in love with it yourself if you encounter it. That love is genuine, and it's worth fighting for. The people who respected that love and wanted those people protected, and still want those people protected, don't deserve the hatred that's going on right now. Those fans in China are just as pissed off as anyone about this, and rightly so. But unlike us, they're not blaming their own. They know who's really to blame here. The CCP. I was once a fundamentalist Christian years ago, the child prodigy of a Lutheran upbringing and a Pentecostal conversion who spent his entire teenage years going gung-ho for God. My high school years were spent with me reading a Gideon New Testament in study hall, wearing striper t-shirts and condemning Dungeons and Dragons as demonic during the satanic panic of the 80s. I know what a fundamentalist witch hunt looks like. And that feels like what this is devolving into now. I've made many of the points that I've just made on social media leading up to this, and for that I've been called bootlicker, a toady, and much worse. I've had people yell at me that I have no proof that the Hugo administrators were trying to keep our Chinese friends out of jail, even though any alternative possibility is absurd beyond lunacy. I've had people lose their temper and block me. But I know that standing up to irrational hatred is the right thing to do here. And in that vein, let me just disqualify myself from ever being considered for a Hugo Award administrated within China. Fuck Chairman Xi. Free Hong Kong, free Tibet, vive les Uyghurs, and Taiwan is free and should always remain so. It's time to focus our blame where it belongs, the CCP. As such, we also need to stand up to other things here at home. We need to stand up to pro-Russian and therefore pro-CCP bullshit from the right-wing media cult right here in America. At long last, let's do something about those lies. We need to support Ukraine and send a clear and unambiguous message to China that an invasion of another country, hint, hint, will not be tolerated. We need to make sure that a certain orange autocrat does not come within a country mile of ever becoming president again. And we need to stand with our fellow SFF fans in China when, not if, they eventually decide to make their move to make China into a democracy. And that may be sooner than we all expect. In large part, I believe, because Worldcon was held in Chengdu, and this sad, stupid outcome was the result. and that left a bad taste in their mouths, they will remember. Thanks for watching.